From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Disney sues Governor Ron DeSantis. Does it have a plausible legal claim? And why do both parties think they have an interest in continuing this feud? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. Welcome and happy Friday to you both. This dispute between Disney and Florida's DeSantis began more than a year ago over the state's Parental Rights in Education Act, which critics called the Don't Say Gay bill. But now it has reached federal court. DeSantis moved to take over this special taxing district around Disney World, formerly called the Reedy Creek Improvement District. Its successor has now moved to void some of the agreements that it made with Disney. The company says in its lawsuit, it is a clear violation of Disney's federal constitutional rights under the Contracts Clause, the Takings Clause, the Due Process Clause, and the First Amendment for the state to inflict a concerted campaign of retaliation because the company expressed an opinion with which the government disagreed. Disney thus seeks relief from this court in order to carry out its long-held business plans. Let's listen to Governor Ron DeSantis responding during his overseas visit. He's in Israel.
Giving companies their own governments, that is not what a free market is all about, last I checked. In fact, they're upset because they're actually having to live by the same rules as everybody else. They don't want to have to pay the same taxes as everybody else, and they want to be able to control things without proper oversight, which every other Floridian has to have this type of oversight. All Florida businesses. So it's a little bit much to be complaining about that. I don't think the suit has merit. I think it's political. I think they filed, in Tallahassee for a reason because they're trying to generate, some district court decision. But we're very confident on the law.
And here's House Speaker Kevin McCarthy responding on CNBC.
The one thing I would take, I'd give them the same advice I give President Biden. Why wouldn't you sit down and negotiate and talk? If there's differences, you can always find ways that you can solve this problem. If you think the only action is to go to court, I believe that's wrong in the places instead of solving it. This is a big employer inside Florida. I think the governor should sit down with him. I don't think the idea of building a prison next to a place that you bring your family is the best idea. I think it would be much better if you sat down and solved the problems. But for the same point, if you're going to be a large employer inside this state, you should also abide by the rules and run your business and don't think you should get into politics.
Alicia, you've looked at these legal filings. What is the legal argument that Disney is making? And do you think it has a plausible case to make in federal court?
So I do. And so you mentioned there are about 5 claims. There's a due process claim. There's a contracts clause claim. There's a First Amendment claim. There is a takings clause claim. And I think in my view, the strongest claim is on the contracts clause. And, I've been actually covering this for years. The contracts clause under the U.S. Constitution prohibits states from impairing contracts unless they are necessary to serve an important government interest. And the reason why I say I've been covering this for years is because this is exactly what has tripped up a lot of states who want to reform their pensions, is that federal courts have ruled that pensions are contracts, which is important to know in this case because what the state or the governor DeSantis' handpicked board under this special Orlando district that the Republican legislature has established has basically torn up 2 land development agreements that the Reedy Creek board and Disney entered into before the power handover in February. Now, these agreements in themselves don't actually do all that much or as much as some of the Republicans are presenting it. They give it essentially long-term certainty over investments in terms of what land they can develop. And in fact, the state last year actually approved its land development plans. They do not in any way limit its ability to use eminent domain or raise taxes on Disney. Now, I think the contracts clause is the clearest and strongest argument because it's pretty clear. But I think it could also stand a chance of winning on the First Amendment argument, in where Disney claims that is being politically retaliated against for speaking out against the mislabeled Don't Say Gay law. It's pretty clear from the quotes from the governor and other Republican leaders that that was true. But the question is whether that in itself is a First Amendment violation.
I'll read a couple of the quotes in the lawsuit that Disney brings to explain that, in their view, this is clear retaliation from the state of Florida. One is from a member of the Florida House who sponsored the original bill to dissolve the Reedy Creek District. He said, "You kick the hornet's nest, things come up. And I will say this, you got me on one thing. This bill does target one company. It targets the Walt Disney Company." Disney also quotes Governor DeSantis' memoir. He writes, "Disney did not have enough time to put its army of high-powered lobbyists to work to try to derail the bill. That the legislature agreed to take it up would have been unthinkable just a few months before. Disney had clearly crossed a line in its support of indoctrinating very young school children in woke gender identity politics," unquote. And so I don't know how the state of Florida or Governor DeSantis would argue in response to the lawsuit that this was not retaliation, more or less, or a response to Disney's interjection of itself into this political debate over education in the state of Florida. But to the point that Alicia makes about the First Amendment claim, part of what makes this, I think, an interesting legal issue is that we're talking about changes to sort of a favor that the state of Florida had given to Disney. And I will cite another one. Ron DeSantis signed a social media bill in 2021 that regulates how social media companies can moderate content. And it includes an exemption for, quote, "a company that owns and operates a theme park or entertainment complex as defined under a different Florida law." And one of the House sponsors of this bill said the exemption was added in order to make sure that Disney Plus was not caught up in the regulations of the bill. So the context is different. In 2021, the Florida legislature obviously liked Disney and was in the mood to bestow a carve-out like that on the company. Now it doesn't like Disney. But Kim, the question that this raises is, if the state of Florida removes a favor like that, is that unconstitutional retaliation? Because if the answer is yes, then it suggests that if the government gives a company a favor, then the company sort of has a right to that favor later, and there are only certain conditions under which the state can rescind it.
Right. This is why I think this whole issue is a lot more complicated than the Disney lawsuit would have it. Even in terms of the First Amendment argument, yes, public companies have a protected speech right to go out and engage in things. At the same time, if they're going to wade into politics, there's likely to be some sort of response. So the question then becomes, what are the limits of that response, at least in terms of the freedom of speech question? Is it somehow too much for a politician to criticize them? What if a politician decides that they don't like what Disney had to say and refuses to speak to their lobbyists anymore? I guess you could call that retaliation, but do public officials have an obligation to meet with anybody's lobbyists? In terms of legislation as well, that gets to your question, Kyle, is if you have gone out and given a big favor to a company, do you somehow give up your right as a legislature to ever claw that back? And then I guess you look at the timing, and does that somehow suggest that it was done in retribution? Or were there other reasons maybe that played in too that had to do with the finances of the state, or a desire overall by politicians to try to level the playing field in terms of what companies are getting? I think this is a very, very thorny issue. And if this lawsuit goes ahead, it could bring up some really interesting questions. My bigger beef with all of this is that why are our companies individually getting these special privileges in the first place? And it's something that continues to flummox me, especially when it comes to Republican governors and Republican legislatures. Why not engage your efforts in lowering tax rates and reducing regulations overall in order to create a positive business environment that companies willingly choose to come use? Instead, you get all these situations where you want to keep the big employer happy, or you want to try to lure a new company to your state, and they get these very targeted, specific packages of tax incentives and payouts to do that, which taxpayers fund, even though there's no real evidence that engaging in this kind of practice really does bolster a local business environment, at least not the kind of specific cases of corporate welfare. And on the other hand, you end up getting disputes like this at times.
Well, I would distinguish extinguish some of those incentives and tax rebates that states often dangle in order to get jobs and businesses to locate with these kinds of special districts, which I have a little bit of sympathy for. So apparently there are about 1,800 of them in the state of Florida. There is one around the Universal theme park. There is one around SeaWorld. There's a huge retirement community called the Villages in Florida. And apparently there's more than one special district related to the Villages. And the idea, I think, is if it makes sense to give some of these big projects the ability to run their own affairs in a way that has benefits, obviously, to them. It's good for Disney to have this Reedy Creek Special District, but also to the cities and the counties that they are located next to. And a couple of ways that I can think about that is one is like zoning. I would guess that there is very little in Disney World that is according to the zoning code and the building code of Orange County, Florida. And does it really make sense to have Disney going before the zoning variance board all the time asking for approval for this or that change to Cinderella's castle? Or does it make more sense to have a specialized group like this Reedy Creek outfit that can manage that and oversee it? Another one would be taxes. So there's all sorts of roads that are in Disney World, and does it make sense for the taxpayers of Orange County writ large to be responsible for paying for those? Or does it make more sense to have a special district where Disney can sort of tax itself in order to pay for those kind of infrastructure improvement projects? And if so, if you think that that makes sense, that that'd be an efficient way to handle it, then this kind of special district is the way to make that happen. And Alicia, I mean, what I think shows that there are benefits not only for Disney, but for the people of the state of Florida in this kind of district is the fact that originally the bill that DeSantis advocated for and that passed the legislature was going to totally eliminate this special district. And then there was all sorts of arguments about what happens to the requirement to upkeep those roads. Does that fall on the county taxpayers? What happens to the debt that the special district already has on its books? Does that fall on taxpayers? And so, Alicia, I think it's telling that in the end, the state of Florida did not eliminate the district at all. Governor DeSantis took it over, which to me makes a little bit more sense because maybe you can make an argument that the state or the government ought to have had more input and control over this process for the last several decades, that Disney had been running its operation with too little oversight. But it does suggest to me that they didn't eliminate it entirely, that there's a reason that it's there.
So the reason why they didn't eliminate it entirely was in part because it holds $1 or $2 billion in debt, and the way they fund this debt is through mostly property taxes. And it's unclear like what would happen to this debt if the district was eliminated. So they essentially just created a new district and the governor appointed a new board. So one of my issues with these districts is that they're basically able to use the governance structure to issue tax-exempt bonds to fund essentially private projects. And that kind of really rankles me. I mean, other states do that in different capacities. But really muni bonds, they're tax exempt and they're supposed to serve a public purpose rather than private purpose. So I think it benefits Disney, and maybe, yes, you can argue that the citizens of Orlando could be actually paying lower property tax if Disney assumes the entire cost. I think you'd have to do a careful analysis to see whether the actual tax benefits are worth it in terms of the people of Florida and Orlando.